It was a cool Friday night on December 6th, 1991, when Austin, Texas, felt like any other place winding down for the weekend. The small yogurt shop at 2949 West Anderson Lane, "I can believe it is yogurt," glowed softly beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of the strip mall. The scent of frozen yogurt, waffle cones, and cleaning solution hung faintly in the air. It was the kind of neighborhood shop where high schoolers worked part-time, where families stopped after dinner, and where the hum of teenage laughter usually filled the silence between closing tasks. But that night would end not with laughter, but with the kind of horror that would haunt the city for decades. Inside, 4 girls were finishing their shift. 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison and her 15-year-old sister Sarah Harbison were cleaning the counters. Their friend Eliza Thomas, 17, worked alongside them, responsible, smart, and kind. She was the sort of teenager who stayed late to help. Joining them that night was 13-year-old Amy Ayers, the youngest of the group, who had come to help the others close up and maybe grab a yogurt before heading home. The girls had plans after work, sleepovers, school activities, maybe catching up on homework. None of them could have imagined that the shop would soon become the scene of one of the most brutal and perplexing crimes in Austin's history. Sometime after 11 p.m., the last customers left. The closed sign was flipped. Jennifer and Eliza handled the register and cleaning duties, while Sarah and Amy wiped tables. They were eager to finish, chatting about weekend plans, maybe laughing about classmates. The mall around them grew quiet. The neighboring businesses had shut down, their parking lots empty except for a few cars under the dim orange glow of streetlights. The city's north side had never been considered dangerous. Austin was a college town, known more for its music scene and laid-back charm than violent crime. But as the clock approached midnight, something sinister was already taking shape. At 11:47 p.m., a passerby noticed smoke rising from the yogurt shop. Moments later, Austin Fire Department units arrived. Firefighters forced their way through the back door, which was locked. Inside, thick black smoke rolled out, an intense heat fueled by accelerant. When the flames were finally extinguished, what they found inside stunned even seasoned responders. Among the burned remains of the shop were the bodies of the 4 girls. They had been bound, gagged, and shot. 2 of them, Jennifer and Eliza, were discovered near the storage area, while Sarah and Amy were closer to the front of the store. The cash register had been emptied, and investigators quickly concluded that someone had set the fire intentionally, likely to destroy evidence. News of the murders hit Austin like a thunderclap. It was the kind of crime that shattered a community's sense of safety. 4 young girls, bright, beloved, full of promise, slain in a small, family-friendly yogurt shop. Within hours, police cordoned off the area, collecting shell casings, melted debris, and fragments of clothing. Detectives theorized it was a robbery gone wrong, but the brutality suggested more than simple theft. Whoever did it had shown a level of cruelty that seemed personal or deeply disturbed. The city's local media flooded the scene the next morning. Headlines screamed of horror in Austin and 4 teens slain. Families gathered, tears streaming, clutching each other outside the burned remains of the shop. Vigil after vigil followed. Candles flickered in the cold air. It was as if Austin had lost its innocence overnight. Parents told their daughters not to work late shifts anymore. Doors were double-locked. Fear had seeped into every home. As investigators combed through the wreckage, a few crucial pieces of evidence emerged. A .22 caliber pistol had been used. Spent shell casings were found near the bodies. The victims had been tied with their own clothing. There were signs that at least 2 of the girls had been sexually assaulted, and accelerant, believed to be lighter fluid or something similar, had been poured over the bodies and ignited. The fire had not only destroyed much of the physical evidence, but also complicated the timeline. Investigators estimated the murders occurred sometime around 11 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., not long before the fire started. But who had been inside the shop with them that late? Witness accounts began pouring in. Some claimed to have seen two young men inside shortly before closing. Others mentioned a suspicious vehicle, a dark-colored SUV or pickup, parked nearby. But as often happens in the chaos of early investigation, reports conflicted. Descriptions varied, leads fizzled out. Detectives interviewed dozens of potential suspects, from ex-employees to local troublemakers, but nothing solid stuck. For the families, time froze. Jennifer and Sarah's mother, Barbara Harbison, was inconsolable. The sisters had been inseparable, bright students who adored animals and shared a close bond. Amy Ayers' parents were in disbelief. Their youngest child had only gone to the yogurt shop for a short while. Eliza Thomas, father, struggled to understand how his hard-working daughter could end up a victim of such horror. The community poured out support, but no comfort could erase the image of four promising young girls robbed of their futures. By 1992, months into the investigation, frustration mounted. The Austin Police Department had assembled one of its largest investigative teams ever. They followed hundreds of leads, tips about strange men, confessions from drifters, even psychics offering clues. Nothing panned out. Pressure from the public intensified, and media coverage kept the case alive. Every anniversary brought renewed questions. How could a crime this brutal remain unsolved? Eventually, detectives began focusing on a group of local teenage boys known to hang around the area: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. They were all in their teens at the time of the murders, known for minor trouble, joyriding, and skipping school, but nothing that hinted at murder. Still, Pierce had been stopped in a mall months after the crime, carrying a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber used in the yogurt shop killings. That discovery sparked renewed interest. Could these boys be the killers? Pierce was brought in for questioning in late 1991. Detectives pressed him for hours. Under intense interrogation, he claimed that he, Scott, and Springsteen were involved. But his story kept changing, and no physical evidence tied them to the scene. Later he recanted, saying police had coerced him. Yet the seed was planted, and investigators kept returning to the same circle of friends. Years passed. Leads went cold. Families of the victims pushed for answers, organizing memorials and demanding that the city never forget. The case file grew thicker, thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and forensic tests. Austin had grown too. The city that once felt small and safe had transformed into a booming metropolis, but the memory of that night still cast a shadow. Detectives changed, but the case never left the homicide unit's bulletin board. Then in 1999, 8 years after the murders, police made a stunning announcement. They had arrested 4 men: Robert Springsteen IV, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. The old teenage friends, now in their 20s, were charged in connection with the yogurt shop murders. News broke fast, and the community felt a wave of both relief and disbelief. Could it really be over? Could these men finally be held accountable for the crime that haunted Austin for nearly a decade? Investigators claimed that new confessions had cracked the case. Michael Scott allegedly confessed after an extensive interrogation, describing how the group robbed the yogurt shop and murdered the girls before setting the fire. Robert Springsteen also gave a statement, his story aligning in parts with Scott's, but defense attorneys quickly argued that both confessions had been coerced. There was still no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, linking any of the men to the scene. Still, the prosecutions moved forward. Robert Springsteen was the first to stand trial in 2001. The courtroom was packed, victims' families sitting shoulder to shoulder with reporters and curious locals. Prosecutors painted Springsteen as the ringleader, describing the crime in excruciating detail. They relied heavily on his confession, despite inconsistencies. In the absence of hard evidence, the emotional weight of the case carried immense power. After deliberating, the jury found Springsteen guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. 2 years later, Michael Scott faced trial and was also convicted, receiving a life sentence. For a moment, it seemed justice had finally come, even if incomplete. Yet beneath the surface, doubts persisted. Legal experts and journalists questioned the reliability of the confessions. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no DNA linking any of the men to the victims. In 2006, new DNA testing became available, far more advanced than what existed in the 1990s. The results stunned everyone. Male DNA recovered from one of the victims did not match any of the convicted men. In fact, it didn't match any known profile in law enforcement databases. The revelation unraveled the state's case. Defense teams filed motions, arguing that the convictions were wrongful. Courts agreed. In 2009, both Springsteen and Scott were released from prison after nearly a decade behind bars. The charges against all 4 men were eventually dropped. The city was once again left without closure. 4 innocent girls had been murdered, 2 men had spent years imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit, and the real killer, or killers, remained unknown. The release reignited public outrage. Families of the victims felt betrayed by a justice system that had promised answers but delivered uncertainty. Detectives reopened the investigation, now with fresh technology and new leads to pursue. They re-examined every piece of evidence, the shell casings, the bindings, even the charred fragments of clothing. Forensic experts worked to isolate more DNA, hoping it could reveal something the original tests had missed. The identity of the unknown male profile became the focus of a renewed manhunt. Even decades later, the yogurt shop murders still evoke deep emotion in Austin. The scene of the crime is gone. The original yogurt shop was demolished years ago, but a small memorial stands near the spot where it once stood. Every year, families and supporters gather there to light candles and remember Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy. The city hasn't forgotten. The case remains technically open, classified as active but unsolved. Detectives continue to believe that modern DNA technology might one day identify the unknown suspect. When Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott walked free in 2009, Austin was divided. To some, it was an overdue correction to a deeply flawed prosecution. To others, it was the collapse of justice for 4 innocent girls. The announcement of their release echoed through the city like a ghost returning to haunt the streets. Families of the victims were devastated, standing once again before cameras, holding the same framed photographs they'd held for nearly 2 decades, their faces worn from grief and time. They wanted answers, not apologies. But in the shadow of new DNA evidence, the truth about what really happened in that yogurt shop had grown murkier than ever. The DNA testing that led to the men's release had been conducted by the Texas Department of Public Safety, ES Updated Forensic Lab. Using technology unavailable in the early 90s, analysts found a male DNA profile on evidence recovered from one of the victims. That DNA didn't match any of the 4 men accused, Springsteen, Scott, Pierce, or Wellborn, nor did it match anyone in the national database. To prosecutors, that was a fatal flaw. Without physical evidence linking the men to the crime scene, the confessions, already tainted by questions of coercion, could no longer stand on their own. The state had no choice but to dismiss the charges. The words "case dismissed" might have been liberating for Springsteen and Scott, but for the families, they were like a reopening of an old wound that had never really healed. The release didn't come quietly. It reignited public interest and skepticism. For years, the confessions had been seen as the cornerstone of the case. Now they were being dismantled in public view. How could 2 men confess to a crime they didn't commit? The answer lay in the nature of the interrogations themselves. Investigators had questioned both men for hours, sometimes over 20 hours at a stretch. They were isolated, pressured, and told details of the crime that only the killers should have known. Eventually, they repeated those details back to police, creating confessions that sounded convincing on paper. But when experts reviewed the tapes, it became clear. Much of the information had been fed to them. They hadn't confessed to what they did. They had confessed to what detectives believed happened. As reporters dug deeper, the cracks in the original investigation widened. Witness statements were inconsistent, evidence was mishandled, and there were troubling accounts of tunnel vision. Detectives so focused on finding closure that they built their case around whoever fit their narrative, rather than where the evidence pointed. The Austin Police Department defended their efforts, arguing that they'd pursued every lead they could with the tools available at the time. But even inside the department, frustration grew. New detectives inherited a file that was massive and messy, tens of thousands of pages long, filled with conflicting accounts, false leads, and forensic dead ends. One of the key investigators from the early days admitted years later that they had been under enormous pressure. The yogurt shop murders had become a citywide obsession, and the community demanded quick justice. The case drew national attention, featured on America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. Politicians spoke about it in public addresses. For law enforcement, the pressure to deliver arrests wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about restoring faith in the city's safety. In that pressure cooker, mistakes were made. And those mistakes may have let the real killer walk free. In the years following the 2009 release, detectives began rebuilding from scratch. Every piece of evidence that survived the fire and time was re-examined. DNA technology continued to evolve rapidly, and in 2017, investigators began exploring next-generation sequencing and genealogical testing. If they could match the unknown male DNA to a distant relative, maybe they could identify him. It had worked in other famous cases like the Golden State Killer, whose identity had been revealed through public genealogy databases. There was hope that the same breakthrough could happen in Austin. But there were challenges. The DNA sample from the yogurt shop was small and partially degraded. It wasn't a full profile, meaning traditional methods of genetic genealogy would be difficult. Still, the possibility lingered that someday soon it might be enough. Detectives refused to close the file. The Austin Police Department's cold case unit made public statements reaffirming that the investigation was active. The department released updated photos of the victims, urging anyone with information, even decades later, to come forward. For the families, the decades brought both resilience and heartache. They had attended trials, watched convictions, seen those convictions overturned, and endured endless speculation online. Each anniversary brought back the same haunting questions. Barbara Harbison, the mother of Jennifer and Sarah, often spoke about her daughter's kindness, their laughter, their plans for college, their love for animals. Amy Ayers' parents rarely spoke publicly, but their grief was apparent in every interview they gave. Eliza Thomas's father had spent years demanding accountability from both prosecutors and police, insisting that the truth still lay buried beneath the mistakes. The case also became a subject of study in criminal justice programs across the country, illustrating the dangers of coerced confessions and investigative bias. Students examined the transcripts, the interrogation footage, and the way information had been shared between suspects during questioning. Experts noted that the confessions of Scott and Springsteen contained details that could easily have been suggested by detectives, intentionally or not. For example, Scott had initially denied involvement, but after being told that his friend had already confessed and implicated him, he began to shift his story. That psychological tactic known as the false evidence ploy can push suspects into fabricating confessions to align with what they think interrogators want to hear. Meanwhile, rumors continued to swirl around other possible suspects. Over the years, several men who were never charged had drawn suspicion due to criminal histories, strange statements, or connections to the area. Some were drifters who passed through Austin around the time of the murders. Others were locals who fit early witness descriptions. Each time a new name surfaced, it reignited hope that maybe this was it, the missing piece that would tie everything together. But time and again, DNA ruled them out. The case's complexity grew heavier with each dead end. The forensic evidence remained both the strongest and weakest link. On one hand, it proved that someone else, an unknown male, had been present. On the other, it was too small a sample to identify that person with certainty. In 2021, reports emerged that investigators were revisiting the DNA through advanced testing methods in partnership with private labs specializing in degraded samples. Though law enforcement kept details quiet, rumors of potential progress spread through online true crime forums and local media. People who had followed the case for years speculated about breakthroughs, hoping for a final name that could bring closure after 3 decades. The yogurt shop murders had long since transcended being just a crime. They had become a part of Austin's identity. Locals who were children at the time still remembered the fear. Teenagers suddenly weren't allowed to work night shifts. Parents began picking up their kids from work instead of letting them walk home. For many, it marked the end of the old Austin, a smaller, safer city where everyone knew everyone. In the aftermath, Austin grew more cautious, more urban, more aware of its fragility. As the years passed, murals and memorials appeared, honoring the 4 girls whose lives were taken too soon. The wrongful convictions also left a permanent scar on the city's legal system. After their release, both Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott filed lawsuits against the city of Austin and Travis County, arguing that their civil rights had been violated through coerced confessions and wrongful imprisonment. Their legal teams argued that investigators had fabricated and manipulated evidence to close a high-profile case. While the lawsuits were eventually dismissed or settled quietly, they forced Austin officials to confront hard questions about accountability and reform. In response, police departments across Texas began implementing new policies, recording interrogations in full, requiring corroboration for confessions, and mandating legal oversight for lengthy questioning sessions. For Springsteen and Scott, freedom didn't bring peace. They had spent years behind bars, labeled as child murderers, their names dragged through headlines. When they were released, they emerged into a world that still viewed them with suspicion. In interviews, both men spoke about the stigma that followed them. They tried to rebuild their lives, but the weight of being tied to such an infamous case never truly lifted. "I lost my 20s, Springsteen once said. "I lost who I was supposed to be." For him and Scott, the label of exonerated could never erase what people remembered. As of the mid-2020s, the yogurt shop murders remain one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. True crime documentaries and podcasts have revisited it repeatedly, each exploring new theories. Some speculate that more than one assailant was involved. Others suggest a lone attacker who managed to subdue all 4 girls. Theories range from opportunistic robbery to targeted crime. One recurring question persists: how could 4 victims be overpowered so quickly? Investigators believe at least 2 perpetrators were present, based on the bindings and sequence of the crime scene. But that theory has never been confirmed. In the years since, new detectives have cycled into the cold case division, inheriting the same box of files, the same haunting photos. One veteran officer once described the case as the ghost of Austin PD, a reminder of both tragedy and humility. Every so often, when advances in forensic science surface, the case is reopened for review. Each test is another small chance to catch the person who walked out of that yogurt shop into the darkness, leaving behind a fire meant to erase everything. Through it all, one thing has never changed: the memory of the four girls. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers are remembered as daughters, sisters, and friends, not just victims. Their lives have inspired scholarships, community events, and renewed focus on supporting victims' families. Their photos still hang in Austin Police Department's cold case office, surrounded by files marked active. Detectives pass by them daily, a silent reminder that justice, even when delayed, is still owed. The passage of time has done little to dull the pain. For those who lived through the early 1990s in Austin, the yogurt shop fire remains as vivid as ever. The smell of smoke, the flashing lights, the disbelief that something so evil could happen in a city so familiar. Each December, a candlelight vigil is held near the original site. Locals, police officers, and family members gather, standing quietly under the night sky. Some bring flowers. Others simply stand in silence, listening to the faint hum of passing traffic and remembering a time when Austin was forever changed. As of today, the DNA remains the most promising lead. Investigators continue to work with genealogical databases, hoping that a familial match will one day reveal a name. The science that once cleared innocent men might also convict the guilty. The irony isn't lost on anyone. And so, the yogurt shop murders endure, a puzzle nearly solved, but forever incomplete, waiting for the final piece that will make sense of the chaos and bring peace to those who have waited more than 30 years. By the time the 2010s turned into the 2020s, Austin had grown beyond recognition. Once a quiet college town, it had become a sprawling city of tech giants, rising rents, and endless construction cranes. But amid the noise of progress, the memory of the yogurt shop murders still lingered like a scar that refused to fade. For the people who had lived through it, the case wasn't just a crime, it was a turning point, a night that marked the end of innocence. And for detectives, journalists, and true crime followers, it remained one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American history. New generations of detectives had inherited the files, boxes upon boxes filled with photos, transcripts, reports, and fragments of burned evidence sealed away since 1991. Each time a new investigator opened one, the weight of the story pressed down on them. The charred remains of the yogurt shop, the haunting crime scene photos, the faces of four girls whose lives were cut short, all reminders of how crucial it was to get this one right. Solving the yogurt shop murders wasn't just about closing a file. It was about restoring a sense of justice to a city that had waited more than 3 decades. The case had already seen everything: false confessions, wrongful convictions, public outrage, and decades of speculation. Yet, as technology evolved, so did the hope that the smallest fragment of DNA could finally lead to an answer. Detectives began working with private forensic laboratories that specialized in degraded and mixed samples, labs capable of extracting usable DNA from materials that once seemed impossible. This included the male DNA profile discovered in 2008 that had cleared Springsteen and Scott. That tiny genetic footprint, less than a droplet, was the one thread investigators couldn't let go of. Forensic scientists began applying advanced techniques like genetic genealogy and familial DNA searches, the same methods that had cracked dozens of cold cases across the country. These techniques didn't rely on finding a perfect match in a criminal database. Instead, they traced family lines, identifying relatives who shared genetic similarities with the unknown suspect. It was meticulous, often slow work, requiring comparisons with thousands of public genetic records. Detectives had to balance privacy concerns with the urgency of justice, but families of the victims made it clear: They wanted every possible method used. If technology could catch serial killers decades after their crimes, why couldn't it find the person who had destroyed their lives? In 2021, whispers began circulating that the Austin Police Department had once again sent the yogurt shop evidence for testing, this time to a leading lab in California known for working with difficult samples. Rumors spread on social media and true crime forums, sparking a wave of renewed attention. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the update, diving into the science behind the search. But the police kept details close, unwilling to raise false hope after so many years of heartbreak. The official statement was simple: the investigation remains active and ongoing. Behind the scenes, investigators quietly re-interviewed people connected to the case. Former employees of the yogurt shop, old witnesses, even past suspects were contacted. Detectives asked questions that had been asked before, but this time with decades of hindsight and new context. Some people had moved away, some had died, and others had simply tried to forget. But for those who still remembered that night in 1991, the memories hadn't faded. Many still recalled seeing two men inside the store just before closing. One customer had reported noticing them sitting at a table, speaking quietly, but their faces had blurred in her mind over the years. Time has a way of smudging the edges of memory. Investigators also looked again at the fire itself. Fire science had advanced considerably since the early 90s, and experts reanalyzed burn patterns and accelerant residues. The conclusion remained consistent. The fire had been deliberately set to destroy evidence. It had started near the rear of the store and burned quickly, fueled by an accelerant, likely lighter fluid or gasoline. The heat had been so intense that it warped metal shelves and melted parts of the cash register. The flames didn't just consume the yogurt shop, they consumed clarity. So much of what could have proven who was there that night was lost in the inferno. And yet, small clues survived: the bindings, the bullet casings, the order of the victims' positions. From these details, behavioral profilers tried to reconstruct the sequence of events. The working theory was that the perpetrators entered near closing time, possibly pretending to be customers. They might have waited until the last real patrons left before revealing their intent. It's believed that the robbery came first. Cash was missing and the register was open. But the violence that followed seemed far beyond what was necessary to cover up theft. It was excessive, cruel, personal. The victims had been tied and shot execution style. Some experts suggested that sexual assault was an element of control and terror rather than desire. A brutal act meant to silence witnesses and dehumanize them before setting the fire to erase everything. True crime researchers continued to debate every aspect. Some believed that the attackers had local knowledge, perhaps someone familiar with the shop's closing routine. Others argued it was a random act, committed by drifters or transient criminals who passed through Austin at the wrong time. A few even suspected the involvement of more than two perpetrators, pointing to the difficulty of controlling 4 victims simultaneously. But without new evidence, these theories remained just that, theories. The truth was still locked away in that DNA profile, waiting for science to finally catch up. Meanwhile, the men once accused of the crime tried to live in the aftermath of their own nightmare. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott had both publicly declared their innocence for years after release. They struggled to find work and peace of mind. Despite their exoneration, whispers followed them everywhere. Some people still believed they were involved, simply because the case had conditioned the public to think so for so long. They both spoke occasionally in interviews, but neither found true closure. Springsteen described the feeling of being haunted, not by guilt, but by what the system had taken from him. The years behind bars had stripped away his youth, his trust, and his ability to move on. "You walk out," he once said, "but a part of you stays in there forever." Michael Scott felt the same. He'd been portrayed in media as unstable and guilt-ridden, his tearful confession replayed on television countless times. But when viewed through the lens of coercion and manipulation, that footage became a symbol of everything wrong with the original investigation. Scott later explained how detectives convinced him that confessing would help him remember the truth, that if he said what they suggested, the fog in his mind would lift. Instead, it destroyed his life. The public's fascination with the case only grew. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels began dissecting every detail. For Austin residents, it wasn't just history, it was personal. Viewers who were born after 1991 learned about the tragedy through these modern retellings. Each piece of content renewed interest, sometimes introducing new amateur theories. Some claimed the unknown DNA might belong to a second, unidentified suspect who fled the state. Others suggested that the real killer had been arrested later for unrelated crimes, but never matched because his DNA hadn't been uploaded to national databases until much later. There were even claims that one of the early suspects, long deceased, had confessed privately to someone before passing away, though such claims were never substantiated. Despite the noise, detectives remained methodical. They couldn't afford to chase rumors. Their work required patience, evidence, and verification. Still, they knew the value of publicity. Every story, every anniversary, every online discussion had the potential to reach someone who knew something, someone who might remember a name, a face, or a detail that never seemed important before. Over time, people who had stayed silent in the early days began to speak. Some feared retaliation back then, others simply hadn't realized what they'd seen. Cold case investigators recorded every new lead, no matter how small. The victims' families continued to be the emotional anchor of the case. They met with detectives regularly, received briefings on progress, and worked with local journalists to keep their daughters' names alive. They didn't want sympathy. They wanted results. Barbara Harbison, in particular, became a quiet but persistent voice for justice, advocating for improvements in how cold cases were handled across Texas. Her determination inspired others, and organizations formed to support victims' families facing long unsolved cases. The yogurt shop tragedy had not only scarred Austin, it had changed how the state approached criminal investigation and victims' rights. By 2024, the yogurt shop murders remained one of the most analyzed cold cases in the nation. Advanced genealogy had identified thousands of suspects in other cases, but the Austin DNA profile continued to resist resolution. It wasn't enough to trace a lineage yet, but it was more than they'd had for decades. Investigators described it as a matter of time. Every month brought new developments in forensic science. Artificial intelligence was now being used to help interpret mixed DNA samples, reconstruct degraded profiles, and cross-reference distant matches faster than ever. What once took years could now be done in weeks. Each breakthrough offered another sliver of hope. But technology wasn't the only tool detectives leaned on. Behavioral experts revisited the crime from a modern profiling perspective. They studied the crime scene through digital reconstructions, analyzing body positions, weapon usage, and the flow of events. They believed the killers may have displayed elements of disorganization, suggesting panic rather than calculation. That meant the crime might have begun as a robbery, but escalated when the perpetrators lost control. If so, at least one of them might have shown signs of guilt afterward. Sudden moves, substance abuse, leaving town unexpectedly. These behavioral ripples were what cold case detectives now chased. Despite decades of silence, hope still flickered. The unknown DNA remained in CODIS, checked regularly against new entries. Every arrest in the country that resulted in DNA collection triggered a new comparison. One match, just one, could finally solve it. It was the same hope that had cracked cases like the Golden State Killer and the Long Island serial killer. Investigators believed that patience would one day pay off, that the name of the person responsible would eventually surface. In the meantime, the yogurt shop murders continued to live in the collective consciousness of Austin. The site of the crime was long gone, replaced by new buildings, but the memory remained sacred. A small plaque nearby bore the names of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy. Each December, candles were placed beside it, glowing softly against the cool Texas night. People driving by would slow down, remembering where they were when they first heard the news all those years ago. The story had become more than just a tragedy. It had become a lesson, a warning, and a symbol of persistence in the pursuit of truth. 30 years later, the question remained as haunting as ever. Who killed the girls in the yogurt shop that night in 1991? Somewhere out there, the answer exists. Maybe the killer walks free, older now, carrying secrets that have grown heavier with time. Maybe he's already gone, his truth buried with him. But for the families, detectives, and the city of Austin, the pursuit continues. Not because the story needs an ending, but because those 4 young girls deserve one. More than 30 years have passed since the night 4 girls were murdered inside that small, frozen yogurt shop in North Austin. And yet the story still feels unfinished, as if the last page of a long, painful chapter remains blank. Every so often, new detectives walk into the Austin Police Department's cold case office and pull out the same weathered boxes of evidence. The scent of old paper and burned plastic clings to the files. Inside are photographs that once made seasoned officers leave the room in silence, transcripts of endless interrogations, and fragments of statements that never quite added up. The yogurt shop murders have haunted every generation of investigators who have inherited them, a grim reminder that even the most determined pursuit of justice can fall short when evidence burns away and truth hides behind time. In the modern era of crime solving, the case has become almost mythic. True crime forums discuss it like an unsolved riddle. Podcasts pick apart the smallest details, and journalists revisit the scene in documentaries, hoping to uncover something overlooked. But those who've reworked the case firsthand say that the biggest mystery isn't just who did it. It is how so many things went wrong in trying to find that answer. From the earliest hours of the investigation, the case was tangled in chaos. Firefighters had to trample through the scene to extinguish the blaze, unintentionally destroying evidence. Officers struggled to contain the perimeter as curious onlookers gathered outside the strip mall in disbelief. Evidence collection was inconsistent, and key items that might have led to a clearer picture were either contaminated or lost. By the time the sun rose on December 7, 1991, the damage was already done, not just to the yogurt shop, but to the clarity investigators desperately needed. Over the years, many have tried to reconstruct what happened inside that shop. Based on the layout and the limited evidence that survived, investigators believe that the perpetrators entered sometime after the store locked its doors, but before the girls finished closing duties. They may have been armed, or they might have pretended to be customers needing a quick purchase before closing. It's possible that the girls, being kind and accommodating, let them stay. Once the attackers revealed their true intentions, chaos likely unfolded fast. The crime had elements of control and cruelty. The girls were bound, gagged, and shot execution style. The nature of their wounds indicated they were killed close together in time, perhaps within minutes of one another. The decision to set the fire afterward suggested panic, a desperate act to destroy traces of identity and DNA. But the killers made a crucial mistake. Fire can erase much, but not everything. What little DNA survived has become the linchpin of the investigation. A single male genetic profile, unidentified but undeniable, has remained at the center of every modern lead. In recent years, detectives partnered with advanced genetic genealogy labs that specialize in building family trees from partial DNA fragments. These labs can take the smallest sample, compare it to public genetic databases, and begin tracing distant relatives. It's the same technology that identified the Golden State Killer after 40 years of mystery. For Austin detectives, it's a beacon of hope. Each time they run the profile, they get a little closer to understanding who the unknown male might be. But genetic genealogy is painstaking work. Even one degraded section of DNA can cause delays. The investigators have to wait for the technology to catch up, and in this case, patience is the only currency they can spend. Meanwhile, the city around them has moved on in some ways, but never truly forgotten. The original yogurt shop is long gone. In its place stands a different business, modern and clean, with no visible trace of what happened there. But those who know, those who lived in Austin in 1991, still pause when they drive past that address. Some stop and whisper a prayer. Others can't bear to look at all. The pain of that December night lingers like an echo in the walls of the city. For many, it marked the end of an era when Austin felt small and safe. Before headlines of mass shootings and organized crime ever reached its streets, parents who once told their children to be home before dark began waiting outside every job, restaurant, and after-school activity. The yogurt shop murders weren't just a crime, they were a cultural shift. The families of the victims have carried that weight for more than 3 decades. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison's mother, Barbara, has kept her daughter's memory alive through photos, scholarships, and interviews. Eliza Thomas's father continues to advocate for cold case reform, reminding people that unsolved doesn't mean forgotten. Amy Ayers' family, once private and grieving in silence, has since joined efforts to keep the case in public conversation. Their resilience is what keeps the story alive. They have endured false hopes, wrongful convictions, and repeated heartbreaks, but their love for their daughters never dimmed. Every year, on the anniversary of the murders, they gather at the small memorial near Anderson Lane, light candles, and watch them flicker against the night sky, each flame representing a life cut short. In the last few years, detectives have begun using artificial intelligence to assist in evidence analysis. Sophisticated programs can now recreate 3-dimensional renderings of the crime scene based on surviving photos and physical dimensions. They can simulate line of sight, trajectory, and even fire spread patterns. One recent reconstruction suggested that the attackers likely entered from the front rather than the back, countering early theories. The fire's origin point, previously thought to be near the rear storage room, may have actually started closer to the counter area, an indication that the killers may have poured accelerant as they exited. These virtual reconstructions can't name the perpetrators, but they can clarify what might have happened second by second, giving investigators a clearer picture of the chaos that unfolded. Psychological profilers have also revisited the case, examining the behaviors displayed at the scene. The crime demonstrated a blend of organization and impulsivity. The attackers had enough control to bind multiple victims, but lacked the precision of professional criminals. The fire, the excessive violence, and the use of a small-caliber weapon all pointed to inexperience. That combination, control mixed with panic, suggests young perpetrators, possibly under the influence or acting out of fear. Some experts have speculated that the killers may have been teenagers or young adults, familiar with the victims or the store, and terrified once the situation escalated beyond their control. If true, that could explain why so many of the early suspects were young men from the area who fit that description. But without DNA confirmation, it remains only theory. In modern Austin, the yogurt shop murders have become a haunting symbol, a lesson often discussed in police academies, legal studies programs, and forensic seminars. Law enforcement officers learn about it as a cautionary tale of how investigative bias and pressure can derail justice. The case prompted reforms statewide, including mandatory video recording of interrogations and stricter requirements for corroborating confessions with physical evidence. It's no exaggeration to say that the failures of the yogurt shop investigation helped improve criminal procedure across Texas. Yet even with those lessons learned, the original victims have never received the justice they deserve. In 2023, when Austin marked the 32nd anniversary of the murders, a new development quietly made headlines. A spokesperson for the Austin Police Department confirmed that the case had once again been submitted for genealogical DNA analysis, using a next-generation sequencing process capable of decoding genetic material previously considered too degraded for use. The spokesperson declined to elaborate on what was found, but hinted that investigators were encouraged. It wasn't the kind of headline that brought closure, but it was enough to spark renewed hope among those who had followed the story since the beginning. Local television stations revisited the case with retrospectives, replaying archive footage from 1991, black smoke, flashing red lights, tearful families outside the store. Younger viewers, some born years after the tragedy, discovered the story for the first time. And in the comment sections of those broadcasts, strangers from across the country expressed the same sentiment. This case deserves to be solved. Public speculation surged again, with online sleuths proposing new suspects. Some suggested that the unknown DNA could belong to a customer who happened to be in the shop before the murders, someone innocent whose presence was never recorded. Others believed it might belong to a transient criminal who committed similar acts elsewhere. The most compelling theory circulating online involved a man later convicted of multiple violent crimes in Texas who had been in the Austin area in the early 1990s. Though investigators have never confirmed it, amateur researchers claimed certain behavioral parallels between his known crimes and the yogurt shop murders. Yet, until official DNA results are released, those theories remain just whispers on the internet, carried by the endless curiosity of true crime enthusiasts. Meanwhile, for the families, every new theory brings mixed emotions. Hope, fear, exhaustion, they've felt them all. Each time detectives call with an update, they brace themselves for either closure or disappointment. They've spent more than half their lives waiting for a name, a face, a confession that holds up. The mothers and fathers who once stood outside the burned shop now have grey hair and grandchildren, yet they still gather each December to honor their daughters. The pain hasn't dulled, it has simply settled deeper, becoming part of who they are. There's also the lingering question of how many people were truly involved. Most experts now agree there were likely at least 2 attackers. The logistics of binding 4 victims, moving them, and setting the fire within minutes suggest teamwork, but whether both were active participants or one was a reluctant accomplice remains unknown. It's possible one of them has lived in quiet torment for decades, unable to speak, haunted by what happened. Cold case detectives often say that time can work in their favor. Guilt grows heavier, secrets grow harder to keep. They hope that someone, somewhere, might eventually confess, not for fame, but to finally free themselves from the weight of silence. Today, the yogurt shop murders exist at the intersection of history, grief, and science. The case is taught as much for its emotional toll as its investigative challenges. It reminds the world that progress doesn't always come from victory. It often comes from failure. Austin's police force has acknowledged those early mistakes publicly, vowing that nothing like it will ever happen again. Modern detectives approach every cold case with a blend of empathy and precision that wasn't always there before. They know that behind every file are real people waiting for answers. And so, even now, the investigation continues. The unidentified male DNA profile still sits in national and international databases, cross-referenced every time a new entry is added. It has been checked against hundreds of thousands of profiles worldwide. So far, no match. But technology advances fast, and every year that passes increases the odds that a familial link might surface. Perhaps a distant cousin submits their DNA to a genealogy site out of curiosity. Perhaps an old case in another state finally yields a connection. Maybe, just maybe, the final piece will fall into place. Not because of luck, but because the world has refused to stop asking. For now, Austin keeps its vigil. The city has changed, but the memory of those 4 girls endures like an open wound that refuses to close. Their names, Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, are spoken softly each year at memorial services, not as victims, but as reminders of innocence stolen and resilience unbroken. The candles still burn on the anniversary nights, the same way they did in 1991, their glow reflecting off the cold pavement. Even in the quiet, the city seems to whisper the same words: never forget, never stop searching. Decades have come and gone, yet the embers of that December night in 1991 still burn quietly in Austin's collective memory. The yogurt shop murders are no longer just a cold case. They've become a mirror of time itself, reflecting how technology, justice, and human endurance evolve while grief stands still. The city that once shook under the horror of 4 girls slain in a small, frozen yogurt store has transformed into a tech capital, humming with innovation, music, and nightlife. But beneath the skyline of glass towers and neon lights, there's an unspoken understanding. Austin has ghosts, and none are louder than the ones that came from that little shop on Anderson Lane. By 2025, the case has moved far beyond the tools that existed when the investigation began. The crime scene photographs, once printed in black and white folders, are now digitized in high definition. Forensic databases can cross-reference millions of genetic markers within seconds. Artificial intelligence algorithms reconstruct the original DNA strands destroyed by fire, filling gaps that were once unreadable. And yet, the answer, the single name that could bring peace, remains just out of reach. Every few months, an article resurfaces, a podcast revisits the mystery, or a detective hints at new progress. The public listens closely, hoping the next headline will finally read "Solved." Inside the Austin Police Department's cold case unit, a small team continues to work quietly behind the scenes. They no longer chase false confessions or unreliable witnesses. Instead, they focus on data, digital, genetic, behavioral. The unknown male DNA found on one of the victims has become their compass. It's been retested using the latest next-generation sequencing, cleaned through complex bioinformatic filters, and submitted to multiple genealogical services under court authorization. Each iteration brings more clarity, shrinking the pool of potential relatives, narrowing family lines that stretch across states and generations. The detectives know it is only a matter of time before one of those distant relatives uploads their DNA to a consumer website, and the family tree begins to point toward a single branch. The promise of science, however, hasn't eased the emotional toll. For the families, time has done little to dull the pain. They have learned to live with it, but not past it. Every Christmas season brings back that same empty chair at the table, that same unanswered question. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison's mother, Barbara, keeps their portraits on the mantel. The 2 sisters smile eternally in their school photos, frozen in a world before the horror. Eliza Thomas's father, Tommy, still keeps her old violin stored carefully in its case. He once said that when the case is solved, he'll finally open it again. And Amy Ayers' parents, quiet, private, forever heartbroken, light a single candle each December 6th. "So she's never in the dark," her mother once told a reporter. The case's enduring hold on Austin isn't only about tragedy, it's about failure, resilience, and the human need for truth. It changed how the city saw its police, its prosecutors, and even itself. After the wrongful convictions of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott collapsed in 2009, Austin's law enforcement underwent an uncomfortable reckoning. Internal reviews exposed how tunnel vision and public pressure had compromised the original investigation. The department implemented new policies to ensure no major case could hinge solely on confessions again. Training programs were revamped. Interrogation rooms were equipped with cameras. Young officers today are taught that the yogurt shop murders aren't just a case. They were a warning about what happens when the pursuit of justice outruns the evidence. For Springsteen and Scott, life after exoneration was complicated. They had spent nearly a decade in prison, branded as monsters, only to walk free with no apology that could restore what was lost. Springsteen tried to move out of state, away from the whispers, while Scott quietly settled into a modest life under a different rhythm. Both men occasionally grant interviews, always careful, always tired. They know their names will forever be tied to the yogurt shop murders, even though DNA cleared them completely. They live with the strange paradox of being innocent yet unforgettable. Meanwhile, forensic experts have continued to revisit the evidence. Every few years brings another technological leap, another test that promises to pull something new from what remains. The bullets used in the killings, once thought to be standard .22 caliber rounds, have been re-examined using advanced ballistic comparison software. The system can analyze microscopic striation patterns invisible to the human eye, comparing them against millions of firearm signatures worldwide. If the same gun has been used in another crime since 1991, it might someday appear in that database. The ropes and clothing fragments found at the scene have been scanned with infrared spectroscopy, revealing chemical traces that could point to the type of accelerant used. Even the old cash register drawer has been dusted again, using vacuum-based particle collection that can sometimes capture sweat residue or skin cells decades later. Every item, every scrap, every microgram is one more chance. Despite the methodical science, much of the case's energy still revolves around people, the witnesses, the survivors of grief, and the detectives who refuse to let go. Some of those original officers are long retired, but they still check in on the case periodically, calling the department to ask if anything new has surfaced. They remember the night of the fire, the smell of smoke and charred sugar, the silence that followed when they realized what they'd found. For them, it isn't just a case file, it's a memory burned into their conscience. Over the years, countless suspects have been examined and eliminated. Some names made local headlines, others remained sealed in police records. One theory centered on a pair of men who had been arrested in Louisiana for a similar crime involving arson and assault. Their DNA was tested. No match. Another theory suggested that the murders were connected to an unsolved crime spree across Texas that same year, but again no forensic tie was found. Each lead brought a rush of hope, followed by disappointment. It became almost ritual: rumor, test, silence. But in 2024, investigators confirmed that they had partnered with a private genealogical lab specializing in partial Y chromosome tracing, an approach designed to track paternal lines even when the full DNA sequence isn't available. The company had recently helped solve multiple long unsolved cases nationwide. According to public statements, the yogurt shop sample produced several possible family connections stretching into neighboring states. The lab emphasized that identifying the exact individual would take time, but that they were closer than ever before. The announcement, though brief, reignited public fascination. For the first time in years, hope felt tangible. Media outlets picked up the story instantly. Headlines across Texas read, "Breakthrough possible in Austin's most notorious cold case." Social media flooded with speculation, timelines, and renewed interest in the victims. Younger generations, those who hadn't even been born when the murders occurred, found themselves captivated by the story. On YouTube, documentaries analyzing the case drew millions of views. Podcast hosts debated the ethics of genealogical surveillance and the responsibility of law enforcement to pursue the truth even decades later. The yogurt shop murders, once a fading headline from another century, became a symbol of perseverance, a reminder that no matter how cold a case becomes, it can still be rekindled by determination and science. Inside the cold case unit, detectives know better than to celebrate too early. They've seen false dawns before, but this time feels different. The evidence isn't coming from a confession or a tip. It's coming from data, immutable and silent. One of the detectives leading the current effort, who joined the department long after the original crime, once described it as chasing a shadow with the light of science. He said that solving the yogurt shop murders isn't just about closing a file, it's about giving the city its soul back. As the story continues to evolve, the legacy of the victims remains at the forefront. Every detail about who they were has been preserved in community memory. Jennifer Harbison, 17, was a bright senior with dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Sarah, 15, adored animals too, and often followed her older sister everywhere she went. Eliza Thomas was responsible and kind, known for her warmth and work ethic. 13-year-old Amy Ayers, the youngest, was shy but adventurous, a girl who loved horses and laughter. When people in Austin speak their names today, it isn't with pity, it's with reverence. They are part of the city's story, woven into its fabric forever. Psychologists studying the long-term effects of unsolved crimes often cite the yogurt shop murders as an example of community trauma. The crime didn't just affect the families, it altered the city's psychology. For years, Austin's residents described locking doors earlier, avoiding late-night shifts and mistrusting strangers. It changed the way parents raised their children. But in the same breath, it also united people. Memorial runs, scholarship funds, and advocacy groups emerged in the victims' names. Out of horror came a strange kind of solidarity, a collective vow to remember. That vow is renewed every December. At the small memorial near Anderson Lane, hundreds still gather. Candles line the sidewalk, glowing softly in the winter air. Police officers stand alongside civilians, reporters, and family members. Some cry, others remain silent. The names are read aloud. Every year, when the last candle is lit, the crowd grows still, and the only sound is the faint crackle of flame. For a few moments, the city feels suspended in time, connected by the shared ache of what was lost and the faint glimmer of what might still be found. Even the detectives who have retired or transferred out of Austin find themselves drawn back to that spot. One of them, now gray-haired, once said, "You don't retire from this case, you just wait with it." That sentiment is echoed by everyone who has ever opened the case file. The yogurt shop murders demand patience, humility, and an understanding that sometimes justice moves slower than a lifetime. But it still moves, and so the work continues. The DNA is still being processed through the latest genealogical analysis, with results expected to refine the search even further in 2025. If a match is found, the announcement could come quietly, perhaps a press conference, a somber statement, an arrest, or maybe the truth will surface gradually, piece by piece, until a face emerges from the fog. When that day comes, Austin will breathe again, not in celebration, but in release. The story of the yogurt shop murders isn't only about violence or mystery. It's about endurance. The endurance of families who refuse to let their daughters be forgotten, of investigators who refuse to stop searching, and of a city that learned to confront its darkest chapter with empathy instead of fear. It's a story that began with horror and became a testament to hope. In a world where headlines fade quickly, this one never has, because it touches something universal: the need for answers, the fight for truth, and the belief that even after decades of silence, justice can still speak. As of now, the case remains officially unsolved. The unknown male DNA stands as the single piece of truth connecting the past to the present. Somewhere out there, the person who left it may still walk free, older, changed, perhaps burdened by memory. Maybe he reads the articles, watches the documentaries, hears the whispers on anniversaries, and wonders when the knock will come. Maybe he tells himself that 33 years is too long, that no one will ever find him. But science doesn't forget, and time, though slow, is relentless. The truth always waits for its moment. For Austin, for the families, and for those 4 young girls whose laughter once filled a yogurt shop, that moment is still coming. The lights may have gone out that night, the smoke may have hidden their final moments, but the city remembers. Justice moves quietly, like a flame that refuses to die. And one day, whether by DNA, confession, or fate, the truth will step out of the dark, and the names Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy will finally be followed by one more word that has been missing for far too long: justice.